All right. Welcome to Dear Asian Americans. I hope you're staying safe. Hope you're staying well. We're recording this right in the smack middle of April on the 16th. So um, we're still, most of us are staying home. I'm here in Los Angeles, as you guys know. Our guest is from Seattle, Washington, one of the cities that were hit a little bit earlier and where we found out, unfortunately, about the first mass round of cases of COVID 19. And we don't have just anybody on the show today. We have somebody who's extremely special, a friend of the show, a friend of mine, and a friend of many of our listeners. The first ever Asian American elected official to the Port of Seattle, which is one of the largest ports that brings in travelers, goods, and really money at the end of the day to America through our port in the North Pacific Northwest. So, welcome Sam Cho to the show.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it. Happy to be here.
So, Sam, let's talk. I look at your profile and people who've known you for a while. You've had an very, very fun and interesting life. You have some life experiences, particularly on the professional side, that are, go, wow, that's really impressive. But before we talk about, working at the White House, before we talk about working for Congress, and certainly, um, having this job now that really is
Yeah,
so important to the health, safety, and the economy of all of us. Let's talk about Sam in his earlier years. Talk to me a little bit
yeah,
more about how the Cho family moved to America and where you grew up, and share with us a little bit
yeah,
about growing up.
yeah. No, absolutely. Well, first, thanks so much for having me, and I appreciate this time. And I have to apologize in advance for how scrappy I look right now. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has allowed all of us to let loose a little bit, so I have more facial hair than I normally would have. Um, for those of you who are watching this as well as listening. Um, so,
So
my family, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say that now you got the podcast listeners looking up the video of the interview to see how scrappy you really do look.
Yes. See, that was the
But
whole
if you're
plan to get
listening,
people to
just
start.
imagine a really big beard. Yep.
For an Asian dude too. um, so yeah, so to get back to your question, my parents immigrated to the United States in the late 80s. They were in their early 20s. My parents were actually really young when they had me. My mom was 24 and my dad was 23. And so, they actually immigrated here in the late 80s. I was born in Chicago, but my dad went to the University of Washington. And so I grew up in Seattle. And he actually never finished school because he had to make ends meet for the family. But he worked as a dry cleaner. And like many Korean immigrants, he was a dry cleaner for many, many years. And that's how I grew up. And my parents were first generation immigrants, and so I grew up in the pretty prototypical immigrant household. Spoke Korean at home. Went to Korean school on Saturdays. My parents were extremely devout Christians, and so I grew up in the church. Played pickup basketball every week. All the great things that I think are unique to our culture and our immigrant experience. Um, and so yeah, and then I would just add that this is really a unique story for me because a unique case study, and I think it influences me as a person today. Is that part of our family's success was due to the fact that um, when my dad was a dry cleaner, he had a customer who worked for Costco. Everyone knows Costco, and what happened was one day he was having a conversation with his customer, and this was back in the early 2000s, and Costco was looking to expand beyond the United States, right, opening up warehouses all over the world, and Asia was one of their targets. And so they were just having this casual conversation about Korea and the market in Korea, and whether or not my dad thinks like there's a market for Costco in Korea. And it turns out Costco made a decision to start opening warehouses in Korea. And one of the first things that the guy said was like, "I know nothing about Korea. We don't have a lot of Korea experts." And And my dad, I don't know what came over him, but he just said, "Oh, I know Korea." And so uh, this still baffles me today. For some reason, he went on a limb. He sold the dry cleaning business and started this, contracting company for Costco and became a contractor for Costco in Asia. And so he started helping Costco build warehouses in Korea. He built them in Japan. He built them in Taiwan. And so that's kind of our rags to riches story. Not that we're rich or anything, but um, my dad was given this opportunity, happenstance, and he ran with it, and he started this fairly large construction business in Asia that ran its course, and that was kind of how my family kind of achieved the American dream, so to speak.
How old were you when this was going on, and did you have an
Yeah,
opportunity to take part or at least observe what was going on through this process?
that's such a great question because this was like early 2000s, so I was like in sixth grade middle school when this started to take off. And as much as most API families, like our parents aren't that great at English, right? Like they get by, but they're not like professionally proficient, right? And so I grew up writing my dad's emails. uh,
Wow.
yeah. So, my dad would tell me what he wants to say in Korean. I would translate it into English and I would send them off. And we're talking about like Costco executives, like executives, vice presidents, like people who are like, way up there in the upper echelons of this mass Fortune 500 company had no idea that these emails were coming from a 13-year-old, right? And it's actually really funny because I think that there's a disconnect between the way my dad speaks Korean to people in person and then the way I wrote my emails. So my speculation is that some people were like, how are these guys emails so well written, and how is it that when I actually speak to them, it's like broken English? So I'm sure some people caught on, but that was my experience. That was actually my first exposure to business, entrepreneurship, just the corporate culture. I was kind of just thrown into it because, like many children of immigrants, you're kind of an ambassador between your parents and the rest of the world. And so that was kind of my lived experience. That's how I kind of grew up. I started writing emails for my dad. Even through college, when I was in college, my dad would randomly call me, right? And I knew whenever he called me, it wasn't to check in on me, it was to write an email for him. And I just like impulsively, my impulse to pull out my laptop as I was receiving the call to get on the phone to, start, it was impulse, but yeah, so that's, I would say that I had a pretty good lens into the business.
Talk to me about your, after that. So, as you enter high school and
Yeah,
decided to attend university out in the Washington D.C. area, you grew up. I guess your
yeah,
moving here was due to your father's academics, and then you got a glimpse of small business, and now a little bit of a bigger business.
right.
Um, what were some of your aspirations
Yeah,
growing up in terms of career, and what
yeah,
were your parents' input into that
yeah.
equation?
So I actually, since around that same time in middle school, I had thought that I was going to become a doctor, and like most Asians, I guess. But what was interesting to me is that like never at any point in my life had my parents pressured me into that. That was just a natural desire on my part. Part of it was because when I was in middle school, I went on this missionary trip through the church down to Mexico, and I just saw things and experienced things, and that kind of um, you know helped me to conclude, look, I want to become a doctor, go on medical missions, become the Albert Schweitzer of this generation, or Paul Farmer of this generation. That was kind of like my life goal, was to become the next Paul Farmer, basically, for anyone who knows who that is. um, and so I actually went into college thinking I was going to go to med school. I was pre-med. I was a biological anthropology major, and I was taking all the prerequisites for med school, the OChems of this world, and molecular biology, all that stuff. And then uh, I realized my sophomore year that I was actually pretty pedestrian and mediocre at life science. Like I was not getting the grades that I needed to. to make it into the top med schools, or maybe even med school at all. And so there was a point where I started to question whether or not like I was this is a path for me, and it just so happened that, and thank God for this, is that uh, you know how when you go into school in universities, most universities have like general education requirements or general GURs, where like you have to take different classes in different fields, right, before you actually end up you know going into your major.
Right.
And one of the classes I took was actually like a global studies class, right? So it was a class on like international relations, globalization, all these things, and that fascinated me. Like I remember going into that class kind of reluctant because I didn't really have an interest in any of this because I was pre med, obviously. But then the first lecture, I was like so fascinated by how the world order is, how all these entities, like the UN, the World Bank, IMF, and all these other things. And so it sparked my interest. And I think that was the reason that was the catalyst for why I started to make the transition from being pre med to being an international relations and foreign policy person, right? And so I actually ended up transferring to American University after my sophomore year to study IR, international
Mm.
relations. And I think part of the reason that I was so enticed is because, when you study pre med and bio, you learn about, the very fundamental, like you learn about life on a very like granular level, or a molecular level, right? Carbon and how all these things, but you don't really see it, right? You don't really feel it. Like you're just learning these things. You learn the processes and all these like glycolysis. You learn all these things, but you don't really feel it. When I learned about you know globalization and international relations, like you see it. Like you literally read it
Right.
in the paper, you see it happening in front of you, and so I think that was why it piqued my interest so much. Um, and so basically, when I told my parents had never told me become a doctor, right? But that's probably because I always just wanted to be a doctor. Uh, but I'll tell you, when I told them that I wanted to go from being a doctor to like a foreign policy, like going to foreign policy, they flipped this shit. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but they flipped
Sure.
out.
Say
They were
yeah.
like, yeah, they were like, you've been wanting to be a doctor for years. Like, why do you all of a sudden want to switch? Like, what do you mean you want to transfer schools? Like, it was like a complete storm of, you know, pushback.
Mm.
Um, but I think at the end of the day, my parents trusted me and allowed me to transfer. And I went to American University, graduated with honors from the School of International Service, and yeah, and so that's kind of what that kind of kicked off my career in both foreign policy, international relations, politics, and public policy in general.
Give us some insight to spending some time at the White House as an intern.
Yeah,
What during
yeah,
what many of us would consider more fun days
yeah. The
of
heyday.
yeah.
No, it was a great time. Look, I've been very blessed with the opportunities that I've been presented. I think so basically I interned at the White House Initiative for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, which for short we just call WIAPI, right? And this was under the Obama administration, which was very good about being inclusive and equitable and all the things that we lack today. It seems like from the federal government and the White House, but it was my first lens into domestic politics and like domestic public policy. um, as I had mentioned before, I was an international relations major. My focus was really on foreign policy, not domestic policy. And so when I interned for WIAPI, it was kind of my first foray into domestic policy. Stuff that I worked on was like economic development and opportunities for our community, the API community. How can we promote API small businesses and minority business owners? How can we provide opportunities for them through government programs, grants, and subsidies and stuff like that. And so it really opened my eyes to what's happening on the ground here in the U.S. When my studies were really mostly focused on foreign policy, right? And I think that was kind of another catalyst for me to kind of seriously consider more focusing on domestic stuff as well as foreign policy. But w- when you work at a high level like that, you're basically working with some of the the smartest and brightest and most innovative thinkers in government. Um, and so as a senior in college, that was a tremendous exposure for me,
Mm.
and I still keep in touch with many of the people that I've worked with back then.
Were your parents a bit more relieved or accepting of your decision to go into policy once you told them that White House was in the conversation?
uh, yeah, I mean, I think that they were bought in prior to that, because they saw that how genuinely I was enjoying what I was studying. But there was two things. One was the White House internship, but then also the first job I got out of college was working at the State Department, the U.S. Department of State, which is like the holy grail for foreign policy students. And
Right.
so I think that when they saw that my hard work was paying off and that I was genuinely enjoying what I was doing, I think they were pretty. I mean, they were supportive regardless, but I think they were a little less concerned about the future of my career. Um, because this is not something that most Asian Americans are aware of, right? Like going into policy,
Sure.
politics, and or government is like so foreign to first generation immigrants, and so it was a huge black hole or X factor for them.
I think when we, given the conversations that I've had with not only the guests on this podcast, but obviously my own lived in experience with my friends,
Yeah.
our parents' generation or any early immigrant first generation really sees the American government still as not their own, right? They still view
Right.
it from the context of how is the US government's stance towards Korea, which I still consider home. So there's really not this what some would consider this expectation or audacity to assume that this is my government and that I can play a
Right.
role. And oh, of
Right.
course, color of skin and race and all these things play into
Yeah.
it. Um, so yeah, I think a lot of our peers grew up with this mystique of one, the government is this mythical being,
Right.
and
Right.
two, it wasn't something that we thought ever that we could play in. That
Yeah.
it's not our we don't belong there. We don't have a seat at the
Yeah.
table. It's something
Yeah.
beyond
Yeah. Yeah.
our realm of just keep your head down and study hard. But I think it's you
Yeah.
know for to give context to the listeners and viewers. Sam's been at the White House and at the State Department, then worked for Congresswoman Ami Bera, and it's and then back to federal government through the General Services Administration. So it's not a who's who or let's put the logos on a chart and see how cool it is, but you've
Yeah.
gotten an extremely robust and diverse view of not only how government operates but from a number of different angles. And
Yeah.
yet um, what you're doing a lot now and what you did with your first stint at the White House was more around economic development for Asian Pacific
Mhm.
Americans, which
Mhm.
I think is extra important that we point that out because
Mhm.
representation is extremely important. We need people who look
Mhm.
like us to inspire us to dream of having those positions. But if you don't do
Absolutely.
anything with the platform and the opportunities
Yeah.
and the seat at the table that you have
Yeah.
to help the people
Yeah.
that look like you and ultimately help people like your dad, like,
Yeah.
are we doing is that enough? I think is something that we often think
Yeah.
about. Um,
No,
talk to me about
absolutely.
yeah, talk to me about that, and then how did you
Yeah.
balance just lucky enough to have a seat at the table, as we're told way often,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
the other side of I'm going to make the most of this.
Yeah. So just to kind of go back to what we're used to as and obviously we're not a monolith, right? So everyone's experiences are different, but I think that just to make a quick point is that there's two things about our diaspora and our community that kind of makes it even more difficult for us to penetrate into the public sector or the government side or um, and the first one is that that we are all shaped by our lived experiences, right? And for most of our parents and the first generation, their experiences are actually not friendly when it comes to interfacing with the government, right? I mean, think about Vietnamese refugees who came here, right? They suffered under a communist regime. They're very wary of big government, right? Think about Korean Americans or Korean immigrants who basically lived under authoritarian rule, under Pak Chung-hee and other authoritarians, right? So like the perception or the inclination to get involved with government is actually not there because of our experience. I mean, even Chinese Americans today who have lived under a communist government come to America with certain thoughts about government and some perceptions, and oftentimes that that impedes them from any excessive involvement with government or politicians. And that translates down to their kids too, quite frankly. I was told as a kid, there's three things in life you should never do, right? It's gamble, right? Drugs and politics, right? Um, and so there's that thing that really it's their lived experience as growing up in these regimes or whatever, whether you're Cambodian and you grew up under the Rohingya regime. I mean, there's just so much out there historically that people don't know the context for. Um, and then the other thing is obviously when people think of politics and you're an immigrant, you think of politics within the context of your motherland, right? And so if anyone knows about the politics of Korea, it's very different from the politics of the U.S. And so when my parents were like, "Don't ever go into politics," it was the benchmark was Korean politics, and Korean politics is very different from what it is from here. And so it took me a lot of convincing to say, "Hey, look, like I understand your perspective, but the kind of politics that I'm getting into is different, right? Politics here in the United States is different." Um, but yeah, I mean, going back to your original kind of point about my experience of penetrating into this world and kind of getting a seat at the table, I think what's really important is that what was really important for me at least was that there are people who paved the way for me, or as some people say, like I stand on the shoulders of many giants, right? um, and quite frankly, there aren't a lot in this space, right? I mean, there's a good number of them who are very high profile, right? Like Norman Mineta, who was the former Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of Commerce under two presidents. Gary Locke, Secretary of Commerce, first Asian American governor in the history of this country, served as Secretary of Commerce and Ambassador to China, who's actually like a mentor of mine. A good, he's been so instrumental in my success as an elected official and as a candidate, right? Just being able to text him, call him, and say, "Hey, what do you think about this? How can I do things better?" I think the best on ramp to anything, not just politics, but is to kind of make sure that we're clearing the path for the next generation. And Norm Mineta says this so well. Norm, when I first started thinking about running and was kind of getting into the politics, he always has this saying where he says, if you're fortunate enough to make it to the top, it's your job to press the elevator button and send the elevator back down, right? So that the next guy who comes along has an easier time getting there, right? Um, I think even for myself, it's incumbent on me. I can be the first of anything, right? And another mentor of mine, Marilyn Strickland, who is the mayor of Tacoma here, always says, "I was the first Korean American mayor of Tacoma, but I should never be the last." Like you can be the first of anything, but you should never be the last, right? And I think that's really, really important because sometimes when you end up in these positions of power or influence with titles, you kind of get into yourself. You know, it's all about you, right? The honorable XYZ, and you forget that you, you did this for a purpose and a reason, and hopefully one of those reasons is to help the next person coming along to make it further, right? No one should have to start over. In fact, they should take over wherever you left off. um, yeah.
I think it's extremely heartwarming and affirming to hear of your relationship with people whose names we've heard for a very, very
Yeah.
long time. We've heard Gary's name recently in an extremely unfair
Yeah.
and stupid way,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's because I think of those people and what you're doing that doesn't make the newspaper in terms of finding the young people, having
Hmm.
conversations like this, because my biggest motivator for wanting to start this thing was because we should know and hear from people like you, Sam, that
Yeah.
hold not, these aren't, yes, being port commissioner is a big, big deal, but in the ranking of federal sexiness of positions, it's not, right? Like
Right.
it's a reach, which actually I would argue that you make policy and you make decisions that far greater impact the people of Washington State and the greater area.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
I don't know, congressmen, senators, people
Yeah.
at that level, get a little bit more of spotlight and maybe fairly so.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's a bigger hill to climb, and that's not obviously their first battle. Everybody's put in their dues. Um,
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about that. You are involved with a lot of different organizations that
Yeah.
are, nonprofit. You sit on the board of the Korean American Coalition up in Washington.
Yep.
You're very involved with the Council for Korean Americans, an
That's right.
organization that I love, and so why is it important for you uh, to spend your precious extra time and resources and energy to do things within the community when you don't have to?
Yeah. So, it's interesting because a lot of people might say that you don't have to, but I actually see it as, an obligation on my part. I think part of the reason why I am so involved with specifically the Korean American community, but also just the AAPI community in general, I actually sit on the Commission for Asian Pacific American Affairs here in Washington, which is a position appointed by the governor. I think a lot of states, including California, and have a commission for AAPIs, basically, right, to make sure that the governor hears the concerns of the AAPI community. Um, I think there's a few reasons. One is just I just feel an obligation to help my community, right? Um, it's the community I grew up in. It's the community that raised me, quite frankly. And so being able to um, do my part, right, is important. But also, I think that it helps me stay connected to my roots. And I've seen, and I think maybe this is because I've seen people in the upper echelons of politics and government who get to a certain point and forget where they came from. Right? And it's not just politics, right? Like a lot of celebrities, athletes, it's very easy for you to forget, right? Like where you come from once you've reached a certain level of privilege or status or stature. And so part of the reason why I try to stay deeply rooted in my community is because the community comes to me with their problems, with their concerns, um, and that for me is a wake up call in many ways to remember, what a reminder of my lived experience, right, as the son of immigrants. On all the, I may not experience certain things anymore because I'm older and because I'm I'm not in the same place in life. But there are other people who have concerns and problems, and some obviously sometimes it's kind of annoying when people like hit me up for random things that are like and Koreans are pretty shameless about just you know, reaching out to other people for things. Not to throw my own people under the bus, um, but at the same time, it keeps me accountable. It keeps me grounded and rooted. And so that's I think for me that's an even bigger reason why I stay rooted in my communities because I need that constant reminder. And I don't say this to and it's not because I think I'm a big shot or it's not this is not a way for me to say this is not a roundabout way of me saying I'm a big deal, but I feel like it doesn't really matter where you are on the totem pole. um, you still need that constant reminder, and it also serves as motivation for me to keep going, right, to keep moving up in that totem pole because I know that there's a need for that, right. And so I think it's a combination of all those reasons.
So you left DC. You had a brief stint in entrepreneurship, which was
Yeah.
successful and timely. Um, but I want to get in your mind of
Yeah.
what the heck got you in the mindset of I want to run not just for the smallest of offices.
Yeah.
Again, I try to frame it earlier, but being the port commissioner of Seattle is a big,
Yeah.
big deal.
Yeah.
I mean, you ended up going up against household names in the state and former mayors of
Yeah.
large cities
That's
and then
right.
so many
Yeah.
other people. And here's this, younger looking Asian kid who has zero background in politics from a state level or local level.
Yeah.
But
That's right.
take me back to what happened or what went through your
Mhm.
mind where you said, I'm interested in politics, number one, and two,
Mhm.
I think I'm the best person for this job.
Yeah. So let me take a step back and just touch upon the fact that I ran an international export and trade business right after. So I served in the Obama administration. The Obama administration ended, and then I started this business in exports and trade. And we can go back to like what that was and all that stuff. But that kind of provided me with and also let me just take another step back and say that when I worked for a member of Congress, Ami Bera, who's actually from California, a part of my portfolio of legislative issue was international trade, right? So trade, if ever, people remember the Trans-Pacific Partnership or TPP, and I worked on that as a legislative assistant in Congress, and so and my dissertation at the London School of Economics was on free trade agreements. So there's like this thread of commonality on the trade front, right? As someone who studied foreign policy, trade was actually my niche area of expertise. And so when the Obama administration ended, I started this international export and trade business precisely because I had kind of the policy know-how on trade, but also because I wanted some on the ground experience and some credibility on trade. Um, when so what happened was it's almost a little over a year now ago, the current port commissioner announced that she was not going to run for re-election. And this is actually a pretty big deal because the port commission is such a cushy, what people perceive as a very cushy, pretty powerful job. Not a lot of electeds let go of that position. And so it's like akin to someone who's been in the office for years and years and years, right? Like Nancy Pelosi obviously suddenly deciding to retire. Um, Except this person was really young. She was in her mid 30s, and everyone thought that she was going to be there for a while. And so the speculation at the time was actually that she was going to run for lieutenant governor or attorney general. So she was leaving to prepare for that next office. So when that position became open, um, I was not actually interested at first. And what happened was a bunch of people started calling me and texting me and emailing me, and people in political circles in the Seattle area, and they were like, "Sam, you're a cookie cutter. If there's like a cookie cutter person for this job, it would be you." I was like, "Dude, I'm 29. If I would ever run, it would be like later in my life. I don't think this is, But then I started thinking about the job seriously, like what does it mean to be a port commissioner? What do they do? And what opportunities there are, And I started to think, you know what? I could actually be good at this job. Like I think I have the right um, the right combination of experiences to be effective as a port commissioner. And then I also noticed that the port commission was extremely white. 5 port commissioners, all white. And so that was another factor for me. It's like, man, there's a lack of diversity on this port commission. Um, but I think that, if there's anyone out there who is considering political office or uh, running for office, one thing that I've emphasized is that, the question you should ask yourself is like, what can you contribute in that position? You know, it should never be about the title or the position itself, right? I believe that, and this is another piece of advice that I received from one of the mentors that I mentioned previously was, running for office and being elected is a means to an end, but not an end in itself, right? So if you're just running for that title, or if you're just running to get that status, you shouldn't run. And I've told this to multiple people who have asked me, should I run? And I asked them, why are you running? And if they can't answer why are they running with anything other than, oh, I want to be a congressman or I want to be a senator, that I won't support them. I won't endorse them, right? You're not doing it for the right reason. When I decided to run, I knew that I can contribute in ways that other people couldn't. As someone who exported and was in the trade sphere as a professional and as a trade policy expert, I knew that by being a port commissioner, right, I can potentially contribute in ways that other people couldn't. Because quite frankly, there are a lot of other positions I could have run for, right? You can run for city council, school board. In fact, most people are like, why are you running for a county-wide position? That's insane. As a first-time candidate, you run for city council or school board, right? Something a little lower and work your way up, right? But to run for a county-wide position as your first, as you say, kind of like, it's kind of insane for a guy who had no name recognition, right? But the reason was because I knew that I'd be good at the job and that I was qualified for the job. Had nothing to do with the title. It had nothing to do with how big the position was. It was everything about the job and what I could contribute to it. Um, and so that's what came over me. I said, you know what? And the other thing, quite frankly, was I saw there was 7 other candidates in this race that had declared, and none of them, in my eyes, were qualified to be in the port. Like they had no experience with trade. They had no experience with port. It was very clear to me that some of them were running just to hold a title
Right.
or a lot of people think the port is a stepping stone towards something bigger. Like I had mentioned that my predecessor might run for something bigger. Um, and I just don't think, that's right, and so I threw my name in the hat to kind of like, stir the pot a little bit. And apparently the voters thought I was, they agreed with me because, I won by a pretty large margin, like over 20% in the general.
Take us through the heart of the campaign season. You had a
Yeah,
bunch of events. You have to go out
yeah,
there.
yeah,
The county is a large county. It's no small population.
yeah,
Um, you said there were 7 other people running. There was a big lack of diversity in the current board.
right.
I can only imagine what the rest of the candidates look like from a visual perspective. Seattle, as we know it today, very diverse with tech companies out there bringing in new folks. But
Mm-hmm.
I would also imagine that the consistent voting bloc of that county and the state still is traditional old time residents. Um,
Yeah,
as
yeah,
and so many angles to this, right? Like you're new to the game,
right,
you don't
right,
have name recognition, you're
right.
Asian, you're not
Yeah,
that
yeah,
old, relatively speaking. Like,
yeah,
what were some of the challenges and how did you overcome being
yeah.
the youngest? And like, you don't belong there.
Right. No, yeah, totally. So, King County is about 2.2 million people. It's, I think, one of the largest counties in the country, probably top 15, top 10. And so it's really large. It encompasses all of Seattle and big suburbs like Bellevue, Redmond, which is where Microsoft is. Bellevue is where basically Jeff Bezos and there's a neighborhood called Medina where like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and all the heavy execs from this area live. It's a pretty big and actually, quite frankly, affluent county. Um, and so there, I mean, we all know there's the good old boys club, right? Like household names. My opponent in the general was the former mayor of Bellevue, so he had great name recognition. And so you're right. There was a lot of hurdles for me as a first time candidate. I think that one of the things that I particularly relish in is being the underdog. And I remember when I first declared, a lot of people's responses were like, "Who the hell is this kid?" Right? This 29-year-old kid who's running a countywide race has never run in his life, and he wants to go up against the former Bellevue mayor. And there were some other candidates who had run previously for the same port commission position. um, but at the end of the day, I feel like one of the things that and I think there's just this hustle mentality where like um, my secret. Everyone after won the race, they were like, "How did you do it? How did you beat the former mayor? How did you fundraise this guy?" Right? He had a lot of money from so the former mayor, he's like a partner at one of the largest law firms here in Seattle. So he had deep pockets. He had a great network of people. He raised a lot of money. And a lot of people who were like institutional, right? People who are kind of like the old boys club. They wrote me off, and they didn't even. They were like, "Yeah, clearly this other guy, this mayor, is going to win." And the answer is really simple. You just outwork your opponent. It's just that hustle, right? Like, don't take anything for granted. um, you outwork your opponent, right? And if you ask people who followed my race, like what did Sam do, or like what made Sam different, I think even one of my colleagues who was running in the same cycle as me on the board, he was like, "I don't know how you did it, but you were everywhere. Like this guy was everywhere. Like and I was for about 6 to 8 months. I was at events back to back to back to back to back." Right? I would show up at one event, shake hands, say hi, give my 2 minute stump speech, shake a little more hands, and then leave to the next event. Right? The biggest disadvantage I had as a candidate was that no one knew who I was. No one knew who I was. And so I need to flip that. And the only way for me to make myself known to everybody was to introduce myself to as many people as I can. So I literally just hustled. Put so much mileage on my car. I just drove all across the county to get in front of as many people as I can, just cold calling, the chambers and all these groups, 50, 100% gatherings, and say, "Hey, can I just stop by for 5 minutes and let me just introduce myself, give them my 2 minutes stump speech, I'll answer a few questions and I'll be out of here, right? You don't even need to put me on the agenda. Let me just like introduce myself, right? And quite frankly, a lot of voters vote with who they're familiar with, right? Like, oh, I've heard that name before, right? Quite frankly, no one follows every candidate in every race. And Port of Seattle races aren't the most sexy, as you mentioned, and people don't follow it. They'll follow like congressional races and gubernatorial races, but they don't follow port commission races, right? So oftentimes they'll just vote for whoever they're. Oh, I've heard that name before, or I've heard good things about this kid, you know. And so that was really what it was. But also, one of the things that people discounted was that I had experience working in government and politics before. I worked for a member of Congress. I worked in the Obama administration, which I would argue the Obama campaigns revolutionized campaigning in 2008 with their use of big data and targeting and their fundraising strategies. They really changed the way, fundamentally changed the way we campaign in the 21st century. And so, I had learned throughout my career of working in DC, I had picked up things, right, that people didn't realize or didn't know. So we had a very strong digital campaign. We had a great mailing campaign. You know, we did a lot of things that were a little outside the box and or a little more millennial or 21st century esque. My opponent was in his 60s and he was very traditional. Like he did everything by the book. Uh, and so that was the difference. And then, obviously I had some great mentors who provided me people like Gary Locke who endorsed me. These endorsements, a lot of people think endorsements don't matter. But when you're a nobody, endorsements matter, right? When you have the former governor, former commerce secretary, and former U.S. ambassador to China endorsing you, people are like, oh, why is Gary Locke endorsing this random kid, right? And then they start looking into you. And so that was, it was a combination of a lot of things. But I think at the end of the day, if you ask me, like, what was the one factor that made you put you over the edge, it was the hustle. And there are people who are very complacent and entitled, and not to badmouth my opponent, but I think there was an element of, oh, yeah, I'm going to win. This kid, whatever, like, I'm the former mayor. Um, people know my name. Yeah, it's going to be an easy win. And I kind of beat him under his nose. He didn't realize all the things that I was doing behind the scenes.
What was election night like with your family and the
Yeah.
emotions?
Yeah. No, I was so we had a small election night party. It's funny. In hindsight, people were like, yeah, everyone was telling me up until election night, oh, you're gonna win, you're gonna be fine. Like you clearly you're gonna win, all these things. I actually had doubts. I didn't know. No idea. And I think most candidates would agree. No, it doesn't matter what the polling says, you never know. And so I decided to have a small election night party because I wasn't sure if I was going to win or not. And so I rented out a small space on the second floor of a small cafe in the International District here in Seattle, which is symbolic in its own right. I wanted to make sure that we did it in my community. And so I did it at a place called Eastern Cafe. Invited, close supporters, friends, relatives. I would say there was probably around 50, give or take, you know, 50 people or so who showed up in total, and we had food. It was great. And my family was there. A lot of supporters. Korean American community was huge in my election. They were very very supportive of me, both financially, but also just in many other ways. Um, and in Washington we have mail-in ballots.
Mm,
So I think California, just like in California,
yeah,
we mail in the ballots, and so the ballots had been coming in for several days now, right? It's not like people were waiting for the polls to close, right?
right.
Like the mail-in ballots have been coming in for several, if not weeks, several weeks now, and so it was just like 8 p.m. We knew that the first drop, the mail-in drop, was going to release, and one of my close friends and mentors, his name is Sung. He was like constantly refreshing. I didn't even want. I wasn't even like on my phone. I didn't even want to be the guy. I was just like, dude, I don't want to. I don't want to be looking at that. Um, and then he just comes up to me and goes, dude, you're up by 16 points. And I was like, what? He goes, yeah, you have 56% of the vote. I was like, shut up. No, I don't. And he goes, no, you're at 56% right now. And the room just exploded. Like it was crazy. And immediately my mom started crying. She came over, gave me a huge hug and kiss in front of all the cameras. It was, you know, it's so funny. There's a picture of my mom giving me a kiss, and it's hilarious. Without context, it would be really weird. Um, but it was like it was a really amazing moment for me and my family. I think, um, quite frankly, I haven't even asked this question yet, but yeah, I want to go back and be like, did you think I was gonna win? Right? Like, ask my parents point blank, did you think I was going? Did you believe that I was gonna win, or were you just supporting me? And they did so much for me because like this is what I wanted to do. Um, but it was pretty amazing. Um, and quite frankly, I'm still getting used to it.
Yeah.
It's definitely hit me, but um, I still feel like I have a bit of an imposter syndrome
Yeah.
when it comes to being elected and being in office. I know, and people have told me, dude, you earned this. You fought for it. You have every right to be in that position and do your thing. But there is still a part of me where I'm like, man, uh, am I in over my head? Am I even qualified for this? I'm 29. What am I doing? Uh, Times where I want to push staff and on certain things, but I'm like, man, am I in my right mind? And so it's been interesting. It's been an interesting experiment for me that I'm still trying to grow into.
It was really fun as an observer, mostly digital, obviously from here in Los Angeles. And, big shout out to our mutual friend, Richard Pyo, who connected
Oh
us
yeah,
last year. And um, it's, it was cool. I mean, look, anytime somebody who looks like me does something big on a stage, it's immediately attention seeking.
yeah,
And when you find out more about the guy and the guy's genuine and he actually gives a shit and it's coming from a good place,
yeah,
and then to see the pictures and the photos and the videos of really the unknown American dream being achieved.
yeah,
American dreams that our parents didn't even know we could have for our children.
yeah,
It's ridiculous. And I
yeah,
don't know, if you're a younger person listening to this, like, look, like, if you ask your parents, you know, what is your cap of my achievement in a public sphere? Public
mm-hmm.
office isn't up there. It's something that,
Mm,
again, for all the reasons you mentioned earlier, Sam, like our frame, our construct, our experiences in our home countries and all that stuff. But
yeah,
I saw those photos. Like your dad has the biggest smile on his face. Like he
yeah,
couldn't wipe it off for weeks, and it's just
yeah,
the immense amount of pride. And look,
yeah,
I put that into the context of like this is chapter. It's not again. This is not your last chapter, right? So,
right.
um, I am so proud of you. I think what you've done so far is amazing.
Thank
Um,
you, man.
and from November it was exciting. In December, I saw the photos and the videos of you getting sworn in, and it
Yeah.
was cool. Um, and then you went through a period of holy shit, what did I sign myself up for?
That's right. I'm still going through that period
Well,
now,
we're
actually.
not through that yet, but take us through what that was like.
Yeah,
Because Seattle,
yeah,
Washington, as we all know, was one of the first cities to get hit
that's
pretty
right.
hard. You,
Yep.
and I guess give us a little bit of context on when we say the port, we're not talking about
Mhm.
just ships, right? Like you're talking, what do
Right.
you actually control and how important
Yeah, yeah.
is the infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of people, even voters in Seattle, don't understand exactly what the Port of Seattle entails. So, we have basically four main functions, or what we call business lines. The first one is obviously cargo, right? So those huge 40-foot, 20-foot containers that come by ocean. That's kind of our bread and butter as far as what we were originally founded to do, right? When the port was originally founded, we were uh, meant to do that kind of stuff. So all those ocean freighters coming from Asia, they come through the port of Seattle. So I always say, you know, unless what unless it was made in Seattle, I mean, made in the U.S., it probably came to the port of Seattle if you live in Seattle, right? Whether it's your food or your clothes on your back or the computers you're using, they probably came through the port of Seattle. The second one, and this one is actually probably is our biggest in terms of budget and money, is the airport. So if you've ever traveled through SeaTac Airport or Seattle International, in Seattle Tacoma International Airport, that is actually Port of Seattle. And so we're actually very unique as a port to have both aviation and maritime. There aren't a lot of ports out there in the country that have both. The usually airports and seaports are kind of segregated or separate, but we're very unique in that we have both. We have both. We as a commission we manage both the airport and the seaport. The third one is cruise. So cruise is a fast growing industry. Um, it's been something that has grown a lot in Seattle, particularly because cruises, shorter cruises, 1 week cruises to Alaska have become very popular amongst Americans and international travel, like retirees. So our cruise industry has exploded here in Seattle, going from Seattle to Alaska. And the last one is commercial fishing, right? So those huge boats that, if you've ever watched the show Deadliest Catch, right? That those boats are actually they're home ported in Seattle.
Huh.
Yeah. So in the off season when they're not up in Alaska, catching uh, you know, king crabs and salmon and whatnot. They're actually home ported in Seattle.
Hmm.
And so in fact, we just sent off the fleet a couple of weeks ago. I did the blessing of the fleet a few weeks ago. It's actually season now for commercial fishing.
Mhm.
So our ports are filled with commercial vessels. But so that's the fourth one is the commercial fishing industry. Um, and so that's the four. And as you alluded to earlier, because of COVID-19 and the pandemic, every business line has taken a hit. Um, and so cruise season is pretty much canceled for the foreseeable future. As everyone knows, travel is down. So aviation, our airport has been seeing a huge drop, like 80% drop in people going, people flying. Cargo was down. Cargo was the first thing to get hit, actually, because we depend so much on China and trade with China that when China first went through COVID-19 pandemic, the international trade plummeted back in like late December, early January, which was before it hit us here, and so we actually felt it a lot sooner than everyone else because of that. Commercial fishing is still happening, so it hasn't taken as big of a hit, but I think the demand for seafoods and goods might go down, so they might take a hit as well. But right now, that's the situation we're in, and this all happened within the first 4 weeks of my office.
So I guess, take me through your mindset of
Yeah,
this. Yes, it falls within the purview of your job. Did we know this
yeah,
was going to happen? Arguable. And, you guys locally acted faster than, other municipalities and obviously, some in the federal government.
yeah,
Um, how did you know, or how do you know what you are doing is right by the community? Because in your group of five, you hold
yeah,
a lot of power, billions of
yeah,
dollars of eventual
yeah.
economic ups and downs,
Mm,
but
yeah,
also the health and safety
right.
of not just Seattle, but it's a big
Yeah,
landing spot for
absolutely.
airports. And it is
Yeah,
an area that is heavily visited and also populated by people from
yep,
Asia. So take
yep,
like how do you
yeah.
do your job?
I, I
It's
think I think the honest answer is that I don't know, and that's been a that's a huge part of the challenge in these uncertain times. The truth is, there's no playbook for what we're dealing with, right? There's no precedence for a global pandemic in the last few years of this magnitude, right? We can point to different case studies of a small you know, pandemics and whatnot, right? Like, it, you know, one thing that I thought about instantly was when I was served in the Obama administration back in 2015, I think it was, we had the Ebola outbreak,
mhm,
right? And if people remember, Ebola became a pretty big concern for everybody, and it didn't end up becoming as big of a problem as this coronavirus pandemic is today. I think partially because we had a competent federal government that was actually good at at dealing with the Ebola outbreak. I think the Obama administration was did a spectacular job at dealing with the Ebola outbreak at the time. And actually, as a follow up to the Ebola outbreak, they 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 put together a playbook for how to deal with the pandemic. Um, when I say there's no playbook for this, it's that this is such a prolonged and pandemic. It's I think it is beyond any like it's beyond what any local government like the Port of Seattle or any city could have prepared for, right? You know, separate from the federal government, just thinking about it from the local and state government side, like there's just no way that we could have prepared for a situation where we were basically on our own, right? Where you, in a normal scenario, in a normal situation like this, we would look to the federal government for guidance on how to
Mm.
tackle these. Right? We say, okay, Center for Disease Control, CDC, how do we do this? Right? What do we need to do? Right? FDA, what do we need to do? White House, give us the guidance on policy. FAA, whatever. Right? We would normally defer to our federal counterparts for guidance on how to deal with these situations. But right now, in the absence of that guidance, we are having to basically just slap shit together and try to like keep things together as much as we can. But that's what I mean when we say there's no playbook for this. Um, Part of the biggest challenge for this case study is that as a port, we've taken a huge revenue hit,
Right.
right? No aviation, no maritime means no revenue for us as a port. We're basically a landlord for all these businesses, and so if you have no revenue, it's going to hurt us. Same for cities. A lot of cities depend on sales tax, uh, business taxes, and or even income taxes for their budgets. And so these local municipalities are being asked to provide economic relief and stimulus to the communities that are being impacted, which they totally should, and they should look to do that as much as they can. But the biggest handicap for us and the biggest handcuffs that we have is we don't even know the fiscal implications of this for ourselves. So if we start giving out money and start providing all the stimulus, we could potentially put ourselves into a situation where we're insolvent or don't have
Right.
enough liquidity to pay our own city staff, port staff, or we might find ourselves in a situation where we have a huge budget deficit.
Mm.
And depending on where you are, budget deficits for municipalities that's actually not constitutional and stuff like that. And so it really puts us in a really bad situation because our decisions, like the decisions that I've had to make in the last 3 or 4 months on providing tenants with relief, providing
Yeah.
economic stimulus packages as a port, has been based on forecasts and projections that we have no degree of certainty on,
Yeah.
right? Like we don't know if this is we don't know if this is going to go on for another month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, or another year.
Right.
So when I say, okay, we're going to give $10 million to the tenants at the Port of Seattle, right? That $10 million is just kind of like is a hit to our budget, obviously, because it's something we're giving away, and we're making those decisions based on very, very non-exact forecasts.
Sure.
And this is the case for every local state government. If you live in a very well-run municipality, hopefully there's a rainy day fund that you can tap into, right? The Port of Seattle has a rainy day fund that we're probably going to tap into. The city of Seattle has a rainy day fund. Our state has a rainy day fund. Um, and so there are certain mechanisms in place for these situations, but at the same time, we need to be smart about how much money we're spending within. If we shoot all our, if we deplete all our ammo within the first month, and we have nothing
Right.
6 months from now, people are going to say, "What the hell?"
Right.
Right? Why was this? Why was your policy so shitty? Or why did you guys do? Why did you guys spend all your money in the first month when this is going on for 6 or 8 months? And so a lot of people think that, oh, like why is government so slow to move or whatever, or provide these packages and stuff. But a lot of it is actually because we don't want to fuck it up, quite
Right.
frankly. And a lot of especially elected officials, are so sensitive to public sentiment, the media, how people perceive what they're doing. There's a lot of risk adversity right now.
Sure.
Just talking to a bunch of other electeds.
Uh, I was just thinking if ever a city had a rainy day fund, I think Seattle's would be very big.
You
Uh,
would think, right?
that's a rain joke
Our
for
rainy day fund is Amazon. It's called Amazon. I'm just kidding. Just kidding.
Oh my god, let's not even get into that because you have some big employers out there who,
Yeah,
from a public safety perspective, move fairly
yeah,
quickly in
yeah,
making
absolutely.
or asking people to stay home. So,
Yep,
Microsoft and Amazon were one of the first two, and so it's like,
that's
holy
right.
crap. Well, one, it was good, but two, it actually led the way for a lot of other organizations down in the
That's right.
Bay and other places to be like, well, holy shit, if they're doing it, aren't they onto something?
Yeah,
Because they're run by very,
yeah,
very smart people. Um,
right.
I think you have, whether it was the job yes, it's a job you signed up for. Was it the actual day to day you signed up for? Nobody knew.
Yeah,
And as you mentioned, you are guided by insight, you are guided by perspective, you are guided by science and the collaborative efforts that you must deploy between your entity, the cities, the counties, the states, and the federal government. I think the entire Seattle and state of Washington has done a far better job. That no news is good news in a way, right? Like,
yeah,
um, obviously, there's too many things going on right now. You see ridiculous videos out of Michigan and other places where it's just,
yeah,
I'm really
yeah,
scared for those people out there that are,
yeah,
it's gonna rear its ugly
yeah,
head in a couple weeks.
yeah,
But we find great uh, confidence and relief in having people like you in place. Um, I think if that doesn't take away a lot of that imposter syndrome of, you are this is the moment you didn't know you were preparing for, right? And I
yeah,
think going all the way back to your childhood of what you did for your dad and all
hmm
that experience, I think the short answer is, whether you are the Port of Seattle commissioner or whether you are any elected official trying to make sense of all this, the short answer is, we don't know much more than the next person, right? And I
hmm
think it's, how do you make decisions in a vacuum that
hmm
you have to defend at some
yeah,
point,
yeah,
but you can't because there is no, not that only there's a playbook, we've never seen anything like this, right? So,
right,
um, it is nice, I guess is a better term, or inspiring
yeah,
to see certain organizations and then large bodies prioritize public health and the humanity of things before financial incentives, because obviously
yeah,
you are a trustee of a large business, in a sense, a
yeah,
publicly owned business. But
yeah,
um, I hope, I know we're going to look back on these times years from now and hopefully be able to chuckle about it, but definitely look back at these times as case studies in leadership and decision making in a vacuum where,
yeah,
how did, and again, it's not you singularly. There's a commission, obviously, and there's tons of staff and resources where
yeah,
you rely on. But um, I think what you've signed up to do and what you're continuing to do is um, well beyond what what society would have pegged you,
yeah,
an immigrant kid
yeah,
at age 30, to do.
totally.
So kudos to you, man. It's
Thanks, man.
stressful. You know, I tried sending you soju via Amazon Prime at one point, or Amazon
Oh,
Fresh,
did you
but
really? That's awesome.
yeah, no, but there were no dates available because, I
Oh,
mean, one, I thought it was cool that you could buy soju on Amazon and then have it delivered. But it's really, really inspiring to see, particularly people of my generation, um, doing that. I think it's weird because in our context, it's a big blurry line, particularly within the Korean American community, of when you're supposed to do adult things because your parents
yeah,
always see you as a kid. And I have kids
yeah,
myself, so like, is it when you become a dad, you're almost a sudden of an adult? Like, you
yeah,
know, you're always being sort of, and this is
yeah,
sort of the imposter syndrome and all this negative self
yeah,
talk, but
yeah,
like, as kids, we looked up to people in the 30s and we're like, damn,
yeah,
they're old, they're
yeah,
adults.
yeah,
And then when
yeah,
you hit
yeah,
your 30s, you're like, I don't know anything still. I'm just still
yeah, yeah.
making it up as I go. So,
Yeah,
um,
but you know what the great irony of that is? The great irony of that, and I feel the exact same way, is that through, especially as the son of as the child of immigrants, and kind of alluding back to when I say you're kind of the ambassador to the rest of the world. You've been doing adult things for your whole life,
Sure.
because there are
We've
things
all
that your
had.
parents,
Yeah.
there's things there are holes that you were filling on behalf of your parents for many years, but never at any point does that come off as an adult thing, right? Like when I was in middle school and writing emails for my dad, never at any point did I think, oh, I'm an adult, like I'm doing these
Right.
adult things. No, I was just helping my parents out, right?
Right.
And so it's very ironic that we still have this like imposter syndrome slash whatever you want to call it, through our lives in our 30s and whatnot. And we think to ourselves, oh, we don't actually know what we're doing or whatever. But when in fact, I feel like we've lived it our entire lives. We just haven't really, noticed it or realized it. And so it's a weird paradox that I think, like, I feel that immigrant children or the children of immigrants live with, and it's very fascinating to think about it that way.
It's a larger phenomenon. We did things because we had to, so we
Yeah,
never thought to call it something,
yeah, exactly.
right?
It's
So
it's just part of life for us,
right. Like, if you actually documented everything a dry cleaner
Yeah,
owner knows how to do and put it in a
yeah,
book, it's a business book.
yeah,
But if you
absolutely.
ask your dad, "What did you do?" He goes, I did
Yeah,
I fed you. I
totally,
ran a
totally,
business. I did what I had to do. I made decisions and, used
totally.
information and made instinctual decisions." Um, this is awesome. I was super excited to have you on the show, uh, and I am overwhelmed by the amount of stories and just, wisdom that I think you've shared with us. I wanna end the show the same way we end all of our shows, and it is an
Yeah,
homage back to the name of the show called Dear Asian Americans, and
mm,
really it is a letter to us and from us, but for all
mm,
of us,
mm-hmm.
because these are conversations that I didn't know we could have when I was in high school.
Yeah,
When you were
yeah,
writing those letters at 13, if
yeah,
somebody who was 17 or even 23 years your senior talked to you publicly or through some sort of medium and said, "Kid, this is how we do things, and if you ever need help, I'm here for you."
yeah,
Not that our lives would have been better because our lives were good
mm-hmm.
and our parents built it for us that way, but just the amount of perspective that I think we would have gained is far
Totally.
different. So that's what we
Yeah,
hope to do with these conversations here. Obviously, there's
yeah,
somebody
yeah,
who's listening that will get inspired to run for public office or to reach out to you.
yeah,
But
yeah,
share
yeah,
with us what you want to say to the larger Asian American community. So
yeah,
I'll start the letter,
yeah.
and if you could help us finish out the show. Um, so, dear Asian Americans,
Be bold, be daring, take risks. Um, Remember that, your parents took a huge risk to come to this country and raise you here, and part of that is in your blood too. So don't think that you need to live this conservative, safe lifestyle. Um, and think about how you can contribute. But at the same time, be safe, right? Don't be reckless and do things that are going to put you in the hole or dig a grave. But I would just say be bold. For too long, I think Asian Americans have been discounted and considered the quiet group, the subservient group, the group that puts their head down and works, right? And hell, we hustle. We definitely hustle and we work. But we can be leaders too, and those are not mutual exclusive things. And so, um, be bold, um, and daring, and be safe.
thank you, Sam. I know these days are challenging for you. These days are long. It seems by the time this episode airs, something will have changed from a local, regional, or national landscape to how we are responding to this pandemic and
Yeah,
um, how we're going to live, at least for the near future.
yeah,
But it's if you're listening to this at home, thank you for staying home. It sucks. I
yeah,
get it. We're tempted to go.
yeah,
The weather's getting nice and kids are getting antsy. If you're listening to this in transit because you have to work, man, extra thank you. It's because of people like you that we can hope to get back to normal as fast as possible. So, Sam, thank you again. Not just for coming on
thank
the show
you.
and sharing your story, but I mean, taking and making that bold decision to run for office, to hustle your face off, to win that seat, to make your parents cry, and really reshape what Korean Americans can do, what Asian Americans can do in American politics, because this is our country. We do deserve a
Yeah,
seat, and you don't have to
absolutely.
wait until you've achieved a ton of stuff in life at age whatever
That's right.
to dream about running. A no name recognition, yes, well educated, yes, well experienced, but new to politics, 29-year-old son of an immigrant kid who looks like me and you can win a county seat in a diverse county of 2.2 million, controlling budgets well north of that, and really making ethical and human based and safe decisions for all of us, not just the people that live there, but food and everything comes through the port of Seattle. So,
Yeah.
man, I can't wait to hang out in person. We were supposed to a month ago, and we're like,
I
well,
know.
better safe to stay home. And
Yeah.
um, until that day comes, rest up,
Thank you. Thank you.
continue kicking ass out there, and really, thank you for making us all proud, man.
Oh, thank you, brother. I really appreciate all you're doing for this, and I think, um, you know, there's this popular saying in politics or just in general where there's only three things in life, right? The things you know, the things you don't know, and the things that you don't know that you don't know. And I feel like part of what this podcast is doing is shedding light on the things that people don't know that they don't know. And so I appreciate that, and yeah, I wish you all the best, man.
Thank you. To better days. Rest up, and we'll
Absolutely.
see each other in person soon, man. Thank you.
Absolutely. Take care. Take care.
Take care.